Everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm so delighted to welcome my friend Tim back again. This is the second time he visited us. The first time, however, we were completely online because we were in the throes of COVID. So it's really so great to have you here with us in person, and all of you have joined us in person. And hello to everybody online. We're so happy that you're here. So just a little bit about our book club in case you don't know anything about it. It started in 2011 as a docent initiative. One of the docents wanted to read all the books that Charles Birchfield read, and that's how we began. We very quickly pivoted to reading the local authors, which is in keeping with the mission of the museum. So we're so happy to do that. And who knew there would be 80 plus authors that we've been able to host thus far. And Tim is certainly one of the best, and I completely enjoyed reading the book. Thank you so much, and I'm so happy you're here. I'm going to turn it over to Michaela, and she'll explain a little bit about the evening's procedures.
Okay, so for everyone on Zoom, this is being recorded, so this will be up tomorrow once I have it edited. And if you have any questions for Tim, please unmute yourself. You can ask right here on the Zoom, so you don't need to use the chat feature. That's it.
Okay, so we're all set. And I welcome Mary Devaney, who is one of our newest docents, and she is not only a wonderful docent, but a terrific facilitator. And so I was delighted when she agreed to facilitate this evening's event. So Mary, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Well, I am an avid sports fan, so I was absolutely thrilled to see these books show up when the list came out, because I said, okay, this is my wheelhouse now, you know. But I'd be honest, I really didn't know that much about you, Tim. So if you wouldn't mind just just maybe sharing a little bit, you know, that dreaded question, tell us about yourself. But if you just share a little bit about your background before we get started.
Sure, be happy to, Mary. I wasn't born in Lockport, but I was raised in Lockport, and I was supposed to be an engineer, a civil engineer, as the oldest of six, as my grandfather was an engineer and my father was an engineer. But then some people started coming through my life who were having maybe a lot more fun than engineers. And one of them was Brock Yates, who's I guess my second uncle, something like that. And he's the one who did several of the Smokey and the Bandit movies.
Oh,
he did Cannonball Run. He would come through my life and I'd go, wow, check out what this guy's doing. And then another person, even though I've only gotten to know her somewhat well, and I use somewhat for sure to emphasize, is Joyce Carol Oates, and was from Lockport. She and I now email. In fact, I was in downtown Lockport today taking a picture of the inside of the library, the Wheeler room and the Sawyer reading room, and I'm going to send those to her because she was asking about if those are still there. Anyway, Joyce, of course, has written a lot about Lockport, Western New York, etc. And the very first time I ever met her, we were at George Mason University, and they were giving her a big award. And I got in trouble for monopolizing her time, even though I wasn't. All she wanted to do was talk about Lockport. And so and I knew, you know, she grew up on the west side of town, which is much more shopping malls, this type of things now. But then she goes, now, Tim, where did you grow up in Lockport? And I went, well, I was on the other side of town, past Lower Town, past Wide Waters, right along the Erie Canal. And as I was saying this, she reached out and kind of grasped hold of my arm, and she had these talons and just kind of dug in, and her eyes got really big. And I kind of, you know, stopped explaining where I was from. And she said, oh, that's the real Lockport. I went, okay, I guess we're on to something. So, and I always enjoyed writing, even though I did it disastrously for a long period of time. But, you know, it's proof if you do something long enough, you can maybe to get better.
Well, I don't know what your very beginnings were, but you know, I know you were an excellent, but I mean, you were an excellent sports writer too, you know, and you really.
And worked here at the Courier Express. And in fact, got a great many friends here, including this one who
was in your house.
Yeah.
I was in your house when the Courier closed, right?
You were in my house when the Courier closed. And our honeymoon, we're driving all around the West. This is before cells, and so nobody could get a hold of us. And my wife, and I'm still married to her after 40 years, kind of said, you got to call Bud Anselm and check on our house. and just check in. And finally I did. And you said the words that still live on in our household, something effective. Your plants are alive, but your paper died 3 days ago. And of course, that was the.
Oh, gosh, yeah. Well, okay, well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. So we are now going to talk about Escape from Cuba.
Yeah,
And this is your latest book, correct?
that is my
this
latest
the
one.
latest. And one thing I didn't realize, I knew that it was a sequel to the Castro's Curveball, but I didn't realize there was such a gap of time from when I saw when that was published in 19 or 20. Yeah,
2000.
yeah, and then this one in like what, almost 20 years between the two books.
You're sounding like my agent, Mary.
Oh, sorry.
But
But, and then, I got to thinking, before I read it, that, well, gee, maybe I should read that one first. But, I have piles of books at home, to read. But I thought, well, let me just dive into this. And what I really loved was the fact that it really stands on its own. That you don't really have to know anything about what came before, that it's a nice little package. So I just want to ask you, could you kind of give us a little synopsis of the story?
Sure. Escape is pretty much said, it's funny, sometimes people go, what are kind of some of the threads in your work? Certainly sports is one, baseball may specifically, history is becoming more apparent. But one of the ones that maybe people don't realize a lot at times is Western New York. And the narrator of both Castro's Curveball and Escape from Castro's Cuba is a guy named Bryan. And it was kind of a washed up catcher who's struggling to kind of hang on in the game. And originally Curveball, the first novel, was done in third person. And it was kind of flat. And I still remember, I only write like in spiral notebooks, and I try to write a page a day. I don't use moleskin or those other things that intimidate me. So I just use spiral. And at that point, my kids were young, really young. I had a high-powered job at USA Today. I think I had 8, 9 people reporting to me. So anytime I went in the office, it was like putting my finger in an electrical outlet. And but I wanted to be doing some of my stuff. And so the only time I had to write was on the subway, on the metro in DC. And I roughly 25 minutes from where I started in Vienna to, at that point, Roslyn, where the USA Today headquarters were. And there was one day I got on the metro and it was already a bad day. And to this day, I don't know quite what was going on. I had a fight with my wife. I don't know. And I got on, and one of the first things that ran through my mind was, I'm not going to write today. As if anybody else in the world cared, nobody else is waiting for the next dispatch from anyone. And so I didn't even take out the notebook. And if I was on the orange line, or people know the DC Metro, you kind of start up above ground, and when you hit Ballston, you go below ground. And when something about going below ground, I suddenly go, hang on, this was a promise you made to yourself. Mm-hmm. This was something you said you would do. And I got out the notebook and very quickly started writing in a first person voice. And I didn't use first person very much at all till that point. And I like to think it was a more desperate voice than mine. It was arguably more honest than I can be at times. And I was just going. I was like, oh, Rosalind, time to go to work. And it wasn't until I got home that night that I opened it up. I went, damn, I love this voice. This voice is good. And it became the voice of Billy Bryan, who is from Western New York, lives somewhere off past Middleport going toward Batavia. And he became the voice of both those novels. Mm-hmm. Now, Mary, you pointed out there was some time that went by. Yeah. And I thought Curveball was going to be it, in terms of what I ever wrote about Cuba. But I took my wife down there in early 2017, right after the presidential election, because my sense was things potentially were going to tighten up. She'd always wanted to go. That was my 4th trip. I've made 4 trips to Cuba because it's gotten under my skin in a way. And I kind of thought it was going to be the usual. And some of it was the usual. I mean, the architecture was still somewhat the same. The Malecón breakwaters, beautiful, all this. But one of the things I noticed right away in talking with some of the people I know down there was, you know, say 10 years before, certainly when Curveball first came out, the way top baseball players got off the island was either go off by raft, which El Duque did and somehow survived, you know, and went on star for the Yankees. And then, or defect while your team is someplace else, like Monterrey, Mexico. We're gonna get to that in a minute. But today they're being spirited off on cigarette boats by Mexican crime syndicates. And they're promising up to a third of their future wages to get off the island. You know, Puig, Yasiel Puig got in big trouble in a sense because he tried to renege on that promise he made with the Mexican crime syndicate. So that got me thinking. And I started going, what if Billy goes back to Cuba somehow and we've got the Mexican crime syndicate? But there was one problem. You know, everything was falling in the line, say from a setting standpoint or whatever. But when I first started that book, yeah, I hadn't talked to Billy in a while. And Billy didn't want to talk to me. And I talk with especially with fiction, I talk with my characters a lot. And gosh, the first couple of weeks I'm trying to write, but Billy, why would you do this? Why would you go back? Crickets, nothing. And I remember talking to Daniel Silva, who's got that great character with Gabriel Alon, you know, through all his books. And I spoke to him and I said, Daniel, do you ever have Gabriel not talk to you? And he said, yeah, a little bit, but stay at him. You know, you just got to warm him up. And finally, after about 3 weeks, Billy started to talk again.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, I really like that story.
The great thing about talking with your characters too, when you're doing fiction, your family members will leave you alone. They think you're going crazy.
Yeah, and they also, if you try to do it on a train, people will.
Yeah, you get a lot of seats around.
Yeah, be sure to, you know, have a lot of really good space. I know they're feeling. So I have to ask this, was Castro really a pitcher?
Yes.
He was, okay.
Was he a good pitcher? That's where I'm pushing the envelope. But my very, very first trip to Havana, we were bopping around. Actually, we were on the eastern end of the island, then came to Havana for a couple of days. And somehow we fell in with this Jesuit priest from, and the school's still there. In fact, I just saw it in 2017 called Balan Jesuit Institute or something. And we ended up, he was showing us around. I'm not quite sure why we ended up over there. But at one point, we're out in the back courtyard and he's showing us the stone wall. And I'm like, where are we going? You know, and I'm having problems with the language. We're with my good friend Milton Jamal, who now is a scout with the Rays. And finally the guy goes, I'm showing you this wall, because see that indentation roughly just above knee level up? And we're kind of going, yeah, what's the deal with that? And he goes, well, as you know, Castro was a student here when he came from the eastern end of the island, where he was considered a hick and was coming to the big city and trying to make a career for himself in something. And he said, Castro loved baseball so much, this is where he would play catch. And then when he ran out of people to play catch, he'd throw against that wall that's got that little indentation there. So I don't know, it is a stretch, but you know, if you look at the Cuban Revolution, Castro lands with what, 80 guys, and they're waiting for him, and yet somehow a dozen escape, including him, his brother, and Che Rivera. And in 3 years later, they have taken over the country. So if somebody wants to say, yeah, I'd like to play baseball and I think I can make the major leagues, which I heard from Cubans on the first trip down, I went, okay, I'm not going to sell that guy short. He's maybe the devil incarnate, but he makes a good character.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I really liked how you kind of interwove. I didn't really know a lot about Cuban history. And I really like how you kind of interwove that with the story. And I know we're going to talk more about that when we get to the next book. That was phenomenal. But
well, if I can just mention real quick, baseball has such baseball has an image problem still, even with the rule changes here. You know, I think it's kind of deemed as too old fashioned. Maybe it's too traditional. You know, it's mom with apple pie, things like that. One of the things that blew my mind in the trips to Cuba is baseball is the game of the revolution. It is the game of an independent Cuba. If you wanted to, in a sense, draw a line in the sand, especially when the Spanish were controlling the island, you went out into the jungle and played this radical new game called baseball. They've been playing it there for more than a century. And this is what Castro tapped into. I mean, one of the first things he did after taking power, and, you know, the guy was, you know, evil in a way, but he knew how to play to his audience. They went on a barnstorming tour of the island, and Castro pitched. Che Guevara played second base. He was terrible, but the people liked it, and they immediately went, "Hey, you know, he knows what we're about. He's playing baseball." So
Great, thank you. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask or any comments?
Uh-oh.
I think I know, but I want to know how you were able to get into Cuba 4 times and what were the circumstances?
And why?
And why?
That's my question.
Why go to Cuba? Cuba got under my skin, and I'm amazed that a world can be so different, and yet it's so close. You know, 95 miles away from the Keys, and yet it's like the land time forgot. I remember when we first landed there, and I was like, going, "What the hell's going on here?" And we, the first time I went was actually on an assignment, you know, for USA Today, and it was something where I kind of wedged my way into this trip, and it ended up, you know, Dan Lebitard was on that, Howard French, who now teaches at Columbia, but he was with Associated Press, and Bill Brubaker, who was at the Post, and it was just wild because you couldn't get into Cuba, so everybody was kind of, what's going on here? And we covered a couple games on the eastern end of the island, where Castro was from, and actually quite a long ways from Havana. And first of all, I thought I knew everything about baseball at that point. You know, I just covered my first World Series, 1991, for Baseball Weekly. The Twins beat the Braves, arguably one of the best World Series ever. And yet I was amazed by the level of play by the Cuban, especially that infield. Like Ken DeLine, Pacheco, Herman Mesa, and probably the best player I think we never saw in this country, Omar Linares, because he didn't defect. And so I'm going, whoa, this is interesting. And we're watching the games, and one of the things I loved about it was they didn't have a press box. They sat us down in the stands, and we had at that point, and for some reason, this is how things turn in a career. I was sitting on the end. I'm not sure why, but that game I was. And this old man came and sat down next to me, and he was Cuban, and he sat down in the aisle right next to me, and he said, "Tell me about the Minnesota Twins." And I went, okay. And I kind of went into my sports talk radio thing a little bit. It's going to be tough for them to repeat. They're going to lose several players. They don't have a lot of money. And he said, "I know all that." I said, "Okay, what do you want from me if you know all that?" And he said, "What do they look like?" And I went, whoa, we are over the rainbow here, because he knew as much about the Twins as I did from a stats standpoint and such, and how they won. But if I showed up there with, I don't know, Jack Morris, he wouldn't recognize Jack Morris. Why? Because they don't get the games, they don't get the media. And so I started going around describing that team, which, you know, put Ken Herbeck at first and Chuck Knobloch, on and on. And the other guys were helping me out a little bit because I was having a brutal time. And I finished with Kirby Puckett in center field, who was, I think, difficult enough to describe in English, let alone some kind of broken Spanish, a bowling ball of a guy that can run like a sprinter and hit epic home runs. I don't know. And as I'm doing so, I'm just kind of looking at the diamond. I'm looking over at Lebitard and the other going, help, you know, and they're throwing in stuff. And so I'm not looking at him. And I had it for a while. And I finally turned back to him and I just said, okay, there you go. There's your 1991 World Series champion Minnesota Twins. And he had tears starting to run down his face. And he got up and tapped me on the shoulder and said, thanks. Now I know. And I went, I don't know where I am, but it is crazy land because they know the game and they play it very well, but they are so cut off from the rest of the world. And so that started the trips, and the trips went all different ways. One was legal, one was maybe not so legal, went through Cancun. There's a scene in Curveball where Billy and his daughter come in and he quickly works out a deal. He, hands the passport with a US 20 inside it. And the Cuban customs guy kind of goes, oh, okay, it takes the 20. Don't stamp the passport. And Billy goes, yes, that actually happened to me.
Wow.
Because then I could kind of go out and look like I'd have been in Cancun for 8 days as opposed to Havana.
Wow.
So
it's really interesting.
yeah, that's why I wish it was, I don't know, it may open up some more. It was opening up under Obama. It's kind of shrunk down a bit. It did under Trump. I'm kind of waiting to see what Biden does because not so much, I think all of you would love Cuba, but I'm thinking more of the people I know in Cuba. If there's going to be any changes, it's going to be because of you all or some of you will visit. I one time was at a game and talking with a couple of members of the sports federation. And I said something to the effect of, what would happen? I'm always doing this. What would happen if the embargo ended tomorrow? And as a good faith gesture, name a sporting goods company, Wilson, Rawlings, Spalding, rolled into this beautiful deep water harbor that you have and with a freighter and just started giving out sports equipment, mostly baseball, but they do everything else too, boxing and everything. And the guy that I kind of broached the subject with got really quiet and he didn't really talk to me for a couple innings. And I went, oh, geez, I've really messed up now. But then after a while, he kind of leaned over and he was whispering, so the others really couldn't hear him that well. And he said, you want to know what it would be like? I went, yeah, I guess. And he said, and I'll never forget these words. He said, the world as we know it would change forever. Okay, well, we're still far away from it, but
yeah. And it's too bad because I've always thought of sports as being sort of a unifying part of our culture where, we learn how now, like you've got baseball is expanding. Look at football. Now it's starting. Do you ever think that like these teams, it will be ever like 100% international?
Sure. I don't know if I'll be around, but I'll answer that with when we went down for the games where the Orioles played in Havana, and which I think turned a lot of people's heads because Omar Linares played amazing. He outdueled Cal Ripken, in my opinion. And we went down by charter. That's another way we went. We went down by charter. You had to be on the charter or else you weren't going to get there. And it was just a who's who of baseball. I mean, Joe Morgan was on, all these people. I mean, the guys doing the game for ESPN. And on the way out, I just happened to be sitting next to Stan Kasten. Now, Stan Kasten, in my mind, is one of the most intelligent guys in sports, period. At one point, he was the main guy with the Atlanta Braves, the Atlanta Thrashers hockey team, and the Atlanta Hawks NBA team. The guy's a genius. And we're kind of taking off out of Havana, maybe got to 20,000 feet, and we're going to go down into Miami. And I just went, Stan, putting in like a AAA team, maybe even a major league team someday in Havana. What do you think? And he just smiled and he said, piece of cake. But you're just waiting for the Rubik's Cube for the political aspect to come together.
Yeah, because you never know when you are going to meet somebody or connect with someone. And I'm going to just make a little brief story because it does have something to do with this. I was traveling through Europe on I always traveled by myself, and I misconnected in a train station in Villach, Austria. Now, Villach, Austria, actually, that is where Wolfgang Puck is from. But I didn't know that at the time, but so, and of course, you know, I had a 2-hour wait, so of course, where do you go? There was nothing there, there was just an industrial park there, so of course you go to the bar.
Sure.
And I got to talking to, he was probably in his maybe 40s. And we got to talking, and he asked me where I was from. And at the time I was living in California. So I said, well, I'm from Los Angeles. He goes, was that where you were born? And I said, no. I said, I was born in, he said, well, where? And I said, well, it's a city. A lot of times they don't even know, you know, where Buffalo is. And I said, well, it's a city, you know, in New York State. You know, you have to define
Right,
state
right.
because they'll think it's in there. And I said, it's, and he goes, well, what's the name of it? And I said, Buffalo. Buffalo Sabres.
There you go.
And I said, yeah. He goes, oh, he goes, when I was a boy, they were my favorite team. And then he's like, oh, the French Connection. He actually named the entire roster of the team that went to the Stanley Cup that year. And he even knew about the bat. that
Oh, really? Oh,
Carrier,
Lorenz in the back.
Lorenz it was who knocked the bat and killed the bat. But it was just, you know, here I am in this little, you know, little border town. It was right on the border of Austria and in Italy, you know, talking to this person. So it's kind of neat. It's, you know, it just really blew my mind. So,
Yeah.
so thank you. I just kind of wanted to share that. Okay, so, well, before we get into your next book, I just wanted to ask you about how did you make the transition? Was the first book, was that your first fiction attempt?
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
But so how did you make that transition going from nonfiction? You know, sports writing, where you're writing facts, and now you have to tell a story.
Sure.
Although I found with the summer of '68, you tell the story anyway, which is great. But did you have any help, or how did you feel about that? Or just you just went ahead and just did it?
No, it was kind of a leap off a cliff, but it's something I wanted to try.
Mhm.
In part because at that point I was in grad school at Hopkins when I was still working full-time at USA Today. So I was doing a kind of
Okay.
night school thing. And I wanted to do something maybe a little bit different. So I came back from the Cuba trip, and I must admit, Mary, my first impulse was, okay, let's do more of a nonfiction book. Maybe it's kind of travel, you know, Castro will be involved. I heard from so many Cubans down there how Castro was at this crossroads in his life at one point, deciding, am I going to go for revolution, or am I going to actually try to be a baseball player and sign? And I'd heard that a little bit before going down, but then to hear it from Cubans, I was going, okay, that's kind of wild. And especially as one who is, you know, remembers, you know, tuck and roll or whatever we did for the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that stuff. I mean, the world would have been much different. But I got a touch with my researching buddies at the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And I said, give me the file on Castro, the ball player. And they did have some stuff, but it was very thin. And I remember going, ooh, okay, if I'm going to do anything on this, I think it's time to try something different. And I struggled a great deal. I mean, you know, we got the story on the Metro, changing it from third person to first person and kind of embracing my inner Billy Bryan. But still, there was some ragged moments around it. And one of them was, how are you going to deal with Castro as a character? You know, here you've got some friends of mine who equate him with Stalin or Hitler or something like that. And, you know, and I didn't want to say, be, pro Castro in a way, but then again, I wasn't going to go maybe like with Dan Le Batard and others, over on that side. So I was struggling very much with that. And I ended up rereading Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald, which I had not read it since high school. And it was with, these folks. And I tend to poo-poo Gatsby a little bit. But first of all, I was reading Gatsby for what I think Fitzgerald does very well, is kind of the first person fade, where sometimes that first person voice is very
Mhm.
strong. It's like he's right on your shoulder, saying, hey, check out this, Gatsby's okay, hanging with it. And other times it's just, it disappears and the
Mhm.
scene just rolls out. And he does that so well. And I was going through actually finding those, just marking them and seeing how he did it. And I hit toward the end of the novel. And Fitzgerald's talking about Daisy and Tom, and Gatsby's dead, and it's all just a mess. And he had a couple lines where he's talking about Daisy and Tom, saying, they were the type of people that didn't look back. They didn't look over their shoulder at the trouble or the heartbreak or whatever. I'm doing a bad verbatim of what they, created.
Careless people.
Careless people.
Yeah.
And I went, Mike Castro is going to be a very careless person. And in a sense, he's going to be so sure of himself that he's just going to barrel ahead. And at that point, I went, okay, I can write that. And I felt it put me with, a character that was intimidating me to a certain extent. It put me more in a sweet spot. And I never would have tried Castro as a character if it hadn't been for Don DeLillo's Underground. Where he's got that opening chapter, he's got Jackie Gleason and Frank Sinatra and all those people. So, it's funny, you kind of look at other books and then something jumps out and you go, okay, and as Alan Schutz, who was one of my mentors, said, he said, plagiarism, you can't copy things, say verbatim, but what you can copy is the craft. But you have to know the craft. You have to really dig down deep and tease it out and diagram it. And then once you have it, then you're asking yourself the question, okay, I understand this to a certain degree. Am I going to do it or not?
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else have any questions before we move on to the next book?
Tim, it seems like with the Cuban baseball players, the whole border thing is just buried. Any talk of that, of guys coming over, trying to get over, it's almost like on the back burner. And I can't say I've even heard a story about anybody defecting or whatever lately. We just sort of disappeared, and all we're concerned about is the Texas wall and all that.
Yeah,
You have any idea what's going on in general?
I think a couple things. Number one, but I think the top players are kind of gone. And so maybe there isn't that push. But there's a documentary, if you can find it, called The Last Out, that came out only 2-3 years ago. And it was about 3 Cubans who defected, and Gus Domingo was the agent, who I think is a little and interesting. And he was showcasing them in Costa Rica and trying to get big contracts for them. And there was the top player, I thought, was an outfielder. I forgot his last name, but his nickname was actually Happy. And and Domingo is like showcasing them, and he's trying to get big contracts because then he'd get a big slice of it. And at one point, about halfway through the documentary, Domingo suddenly goes to Happy and goes, this isn't working. You're out of here. I'm cutting you loose. And you just go, uh-oh. And there was 2 things that happened almost immediately that I found amazing. Number one, the filmmakers had to decide what they're going to do, because Happy's knee-jerk reaction was, okay, Gus Domingo has thrown me out. I'm going to America. And he went up all the way up through, Latin America, up through Mexico, and he didn't make it across. I guess he's now a fitness instructor in Houston. And so I found that amazing. And then what the filmmakers did, there was 2 of them. Well, actually, one guy's in Toronto, and they had to, within 12 hours, decide, okay, what are we doing with this? And one of them just got, a small camera, and he was going with Happy. And it's a great doc. But I think it kind of shows a little bit, it shows how much it's still a dream in Cuba to play here. But sometimes the talent it's not Omar Linares' talent, that I saw 20-some years ago. So it's and sometimes I think they're forgotten a little bit too. So
I remember when Rusty Castillo signed with the Red Sox, defecting from Cuba, and he got like $12 million a year or something like that, phenomenal number. And he wasn't good enough to be a regular.
Right.
And if he'd been a fourth or fifth outfielder, he would have messed up the Red Sox salary cap. So they sent him to glamorous Pawtucket, Rhode Island.
Right, where he was getting paid.
He played out his contract for that money.
Yeah, you know, we've siphoned off so much of the talent there, but that said, they still love the game, you know, and I still talk with some scouts at times and they go, and it still turns their head, you know, if somebody is trying to get out or whatever, I go, yeah, we'll take a long look at him because he's Cuban. Go ahead, yeah, please.
How do you know when you're writing a scene or fiction or nonfiction, if that's working? If it has that sense of verisimilitude or reality or something, or truth that it's working? How do you know about when that happens?
Well, one easy answer is sometimes I show it to my wife. And she kind of, well, what's her favorite saying half the time? She was just telling me that was something that I just finished that'll be out next year. She was going, yeah, parts of this are working, but you got to pump up the bicycle tires on some of this other.
It's the liability of having an editor for a wife.
Yeah, but you know, it's good. But what I'll try to do, and the thing is, I only figured this out in grad school, and you probably figured out a long time before, but I would not, and maybe this is my newspaper background, like nipping me a little bit, but I would just kind of work up right to the deadline and just go, there you go, there you are, you got it. And if I've learned anything over recent years is, okay, I think it's done. Now let's put it aside, you know, it's other stuff to work on. Then you bring it back and you go, hang on a minute. And then you can see very quickly, I think, what's flat or what's not working. And one of the things I've learned over the years, whether it's talking to Billy Bryan late at night or in nonfiction and such, you can pick out pretty quickly what you need. And then you've got to ask the questions to get it. There's a guy named Rick Meyer who used to work at LA Times. He did a great seminar where you can interview, in a sense, in my mind, let's back up. There's two criteria for a scene, in my mind. A scene, the shorthand is action. And even action, it's got to be more specific. A guy walking down the street is just movement. A guy being made chased by the cops is action. A guy even chasing a bus is action. So it's action to event to consequence. You know, that's a shorthand. And if I'm looking at a scene, I'm going, why isn't this working? It's one of those three isn't playing out. And the consequence doesn't need to be like through the roof, but within the realm of the people you're dealing with, fiction or nonfiction, it has to be a pretty big deal. You know, there's a great series that the St. Petersburg Times did, 5-part series, 7-part series, something on 6th graders. Sounds terrible. But there's one scene where the Goody Two-Shoes character steals $1.25 in change from her father's, chest, on top of his Chesterfield. And as soon as she does that, you go, oh God, all hell break loose. And it does, because, and $1.25 doesn't seem like much to you or me, but within that world, it's a huge deal. But Meyer, one of the things he does too with, if something isn't working, then you're going back into it in terms of sensory detail. Some sense you're lacking something.
Okay.
And so then you're adding, sight, sound, taste, touch, whatever it may be. And I think all of us as writers, if you're working creatively, you've got to know what your hierarchy is. Sight tends to be on top with me. That's not unusual. Then probably sound, and sound can be the sound of the words and also say dialogue and such. And then it kind of works down. But I know other writers, almost their top sensory detail might be smell. And the way they write about place is exquisite. So, that's what I learned in grad school, was not try to hand everything on deadline. I would make kind of artificial deadlines and then come back to them. And
was it like a visceral reaction or more of an intellectual reaction that it's working or not working when you're going through these scenes? This is what it needs, or are there through? Is it something that you would sort of feel like here, or is it something you would just think as an intellectual that this needs to be worked on?
In the perfect world, as my old mentor, Alan Shoes used to do the book reviews for NPR. And he was a great, Castro's Curveball wouldn't have gotten done without Alan, but Alan always used to say, and he would remind us the perfect kind of scene isn't all here. It isn't all here. It's in the middle. It's at 45 degree.
Okay.
And that's a fine line. And sometimes you're up doing more mental gymnastics. Other time you're down here and people are saying you're doing melodrama, but that's the way he would like steer us and just say, okay, I think you need a little bit, you're here, bring it up a bit. So Alan was, I miss Alan. Anyway, that's me.
All right, well, great. Well, thank you so much for the questions and the discussion here. But we're going to continue now with 1968, the year that changed baseball. Okay,
America.
why 1968? I kind of know why, but I figured out why, but it was just so it was really interesting because again, 1968 is such a pivotal year in our history, and how you were able to weave that history through baseball. So you could really attract a very large audience with this book.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
honestly, because I had read the Escape from Cuba first,
Mhm.
and then I was kind of putting this one off because I started looking at it like, oh, is it just going to be, about like one season of baseball and that kind of thing? But I said, no, I said, I'm going to read it. And I started reading it and I was like, absolutely blown away because of all the history that was in there. And I got to thinking, wow, it's great that you're able to take, again, somebody who's interested in the sports, great. Somebody who's interested in history, they're going to love it too, because it tells it in such an interesting and different way.
No, thank you.
So why 1968?
I was looking for a new project. And I was playing around with a couple of different things. And I think sometimes when you're starting off a new project, it's very much, and 68 was turning my head a little bit. We used to go to the Unitarian Church out here in Amherst. So I remember Jesse Jackson speaking there. I remember different people. So I was, kind of politicized, early on, I guess. But still, that's not going to make up a book. And I think when you're starting off a project, especially nonfiction in a way, because I think it's easier for publishers, editors to say no to nonfiction, because you're usually going to do it as a proposal. You're not going to write the whole thing. Whereas with a novel, you pretty much have to write the whole thing. So you get like deeper into the weeds. And I'm going, and I was intrigued with the Tigers. My brother Chris was a Tiger fan. I was a Red Sox fan. I was intrigued with the St. Louis Cardinals, mostly because of Bob Gibson. I'd gotten to know Tim McCarver a little bit, Orlando Cepeda. They were kind of a United Nation coalition team. And but still, that's not going to do it. And so I'm going out on thin ice and I'm waiting for the cracks and just to and I'm working on the proposal and the agent's kind of going, yeah, I guess there's something there. There hasn't been much done. Maybe. What can you do? And I completely lucked out. One of the first people I talked to was a guy named Hampton Sides, who's a great writer. And I don't really know him, but my editor at Washingtonian magazine said, you should talk to Hampton. Hampton's in Memphis. You're going to need to deal with Memphis if you're going to go ahead with this project, because that's where Martin Luther King was assassinated and such. And I remember calling up Hampton and again, I didn't really know him, but I said, Ken said, man, I should run this by you. And the first thing he said was, oh, the closest we've come to a second civil war in this country. And I went, okay, we're rolling. And then I had a number of interview requests out and I was looking to match up with some folks. But the very, very first person I spoke with was a guy named John Wharton, who nobody remembers. Nobody remembers John. John was a rookie pitcher on the Detroit Tigers in 1968. It's the only year he played in the major leagues. He's a great guy, but I had a number of dealer's out and John's the one I
Mhm.
rig up with. And John starts telling this story about how he's made the Tigers. The seasons have been delayed because of King's assassination. Him and another rookie pitcher, the only two rookies on the Tigers in 68, a guy named Darrell Patterson, make the team. The team goes north. Everybody gets dropped off at Tiger Stadium. And the team was so veteran oriented, everybody disappeared. You know, and since the families were there to pick them up, other guys had cars stashed. And suddenly it's John and Darrell Patterson walking the streets of Detroit going, where the hell did everybody go? And
Good story.
and Detroit was under curfew.
Mhm.
And so here comes a cop, and a policeman pulls up and says, guys, you're out after curfew. This isn't good. And they go, well, we play for the Tigers. And the guy goes, oh, I'm a Tiger fan. What's your name? And of course, they say there's a guy's never heard of them because they've yet to play for the Tigers. So anyway, the policeman drives him to the Leland Hotel, where they end up taking an efficiency apartment, 1-2 bedroom, I guess, which becomes their home for the whole season. And John then started talking about, and I believe it was on the 8th floor, and he's now looking out over Detroit, you know, this place he's trying to make his mark in baseball. And he's looking out over the city, and all of a sudden the talk of the curfew, you know, it's not that lit up. There's very few cars on the street. All of a sudden he's remembering stuff that like Willie Horton and Al Kaline had told him about the riots in 67,
right.
the worst riots since the Civil War were in Detroit in 67. The team was under such pressure to win. The city fathers had come to them and say, be great if you guys won this year because maybe it'll keep the city from burning down. And John's just looking out over the city and he's going, what have I gotten myself into? And that was the very first interview I did. And I remember that was a phone interview, even though we did an in-person one soon after that. I remember getting off the phone and telling Jackie, my wife, saying, we're onto it. We got it. You know, I've got my first scene, really.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite stories too, when you started telling it. I really did. And it just, because it's so different today.
Yes.
I mean, when you wrote about all the different changes that not only, you know, through our history, but through baseball itself.
Yeah.
And how that was I didn't even realize that was the last year before they started doing playoffs.
Right. And I was reminding the players from both the Cardinals and the Tigers that was the last year that the number one team from the National League, number one team from the American League went directly to the World Series. We didn't have any wild cards or playoffs or division winners and all this stuff. And I must admit, with some of them, I was reminding of this. You know, that was the last year that was done, guys. And they, you know, really, yeah. They got kind of proud about it. It's funny because when I think back of summer, sometimes you got to be lucky. So John's the first interview I do. The last major interview I ended up doing was Reverend Billy Kyles. And Reverend Billy Kyles was part of King's inner cadre, so to speak, with Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young, Ralph Abernathy and such. And it was actually Reverend Kyles' house that they were going to dinner the night King was assassinated. And Kyles to this day will say dinner was supposed to be at 6. I came over and picking him up. And somehow King had called the house or something. And King's understanding was dinner was at 6:30. So therefore he kind of lingered and, you know, and he was always kind of running a little bit late anyway. And so, you know, who would have known if he had time right? But the only way I ended up getting Reverend Kyles is a guy my wife used to work with at the Post had gone back to Memphis, back to Commercial Appeal. And the first time I met this guy was at his going away party in Washington. And I was into the book. And he was like all over me. He was like going, well, hang on, if you're going to do this, you got to visit Memphis. You know, you got to come to Memphis. I'm going, yeah, okay. And he stayed on me. He kept calling me. He kept saying, you haven't come to Memphis yet. If you stay at my house, you know, you gotta come. And finally, I'm running out of money. I'm running out of time. And finally, I'm going, okay. And I went to Memphis. And I remember landing, and he was trying to grease the skids to get me in to see Reverend Kyles. And I landed and, you know, turned on my phone. And I still didn't have a time set, or even, I wasn't quite sure if this interview was gonna come off. And I turn on the phone and all of a sudden I've got a voicemail. It's Reverend Kyle's secretary. And I called her back and I said, what's going on? She said, get your rental car. If you can be here in an hour, Reverend Kyle's will talk to you. And he was phenomenal, you know, just that night and what went down and how the night before, in my mind, two of the best speeches ever given in this country are King's last one and Bobby Kennedy's one, where he announces to the crowd that King has been assassinated in Memphis.
Yeah.
Both of them were done with very little, no real planning. They were kind of riffing to a certain extent, because if you listen to the early part of King's speech at the Masonic Temple in Memphis the night before he's assassinated, first of all, he didn't think he was going to have to give a speech. There was like tornado warnings. He was going, we're not doing anything tonight. And I think it was Ralph Abernathy went down to the Masonic Temple and then quickly called back to the Lorraine Motel and said, Martin, get down here. They want to hear from you. And if you listen to that speech, you can find it streaming. The first 20 minutes aren't very good. And yet then he kind of puts aside maybe any prepared remarks he had, and he just starts kind of going. And here we start getting the mountaintop thing. And he starts throwing in things that had everybody like Kyle's and Andy Young and everybody looking at each other like going, whoa, what's this going on? Because when he hits that, you know, I've been to the mountain, I've looked over this, I've looked over the top, I've seen the promised land, you know, and then he kind of threw in something, but I might not get there with you. And everyone went, what? He had a premonition, something killed. And then the other one, it's much shorter, is Bobby Kennedy in Annapolis, where he's literally going out to speak at on the back of a pickup truck. And everybody there, that's before cell phones, so nobody knows the news, the bad news. Somebody, before he steps out, he kind of turns to somebody and he goes, do they know? And the person, and I believe it's Jeff Greenfield, who went on the CBS News, he says something effective, no, I think you're going to have to tell him. And he tells him, and he pretty much says, Martin Luther King's been assassinated tonight in Memphis. And at least from a sound standpoint, it's almost like the start of a riot. It's you know, people are just getting, and then this is the power of words, I think. Bobby Kennedy very much in a couple minutes got everybody calm back down. And it's one of the very, very few times he mentioned his brother, John, being assassinated, I don't know what, 5 years before, less than that, in Dallas. And the thing that blew me away is he had memorized this poem by Aeschylus, you know, something like what, drop by drop, you know, wisdom, you know, upon the heart or something like that. I'm doing a terrible job of it. But he knew it, and he said that poem that night. And if you look back, you know, the rest of the country went up in riots. Memphis did not riot, and Indianapolis did not riot, pretty much because of the efforts of the individuals in both those cities. So, you know, we do so much stuff now with focus groups and all this stuff with the speeches. Those are two of the best speeches ever given. And it was like, back a little bit here, you know, brain, heart, they nailed it. No,
For sure. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
It's summer. Oh, we got to roll that trailer.
Yeah, we got that.
Would you like to see that
Would you
now?
like to see that now? Brilliant.
Yeah, we must have do some. With summer 68, what's weird is, you know.
We have a couple
Oh,
questions.
go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I'm
I
sorry.
just got a question. What
Sure.
would you give to advise people that are looking to potentially like write a book or start to write or any advice?
Prayer is good. Don't, I guess two things jump to mind. Number one is somehow we think we need all this support early on. But I think if you've got a quality idea, part of the game, in a sense, what makes it frustrating though, is you're trying to find the community that responds to that too. And so that's why I would never tell somebody to send out a bunch of, you've got those books in the library that list all the agents in the country.
Right.
No, just find the ones that are doing really what you're looking to do. And then, because Curveball was, oh Lord, it was rejected 33 times. That's almost 3 years of rejection. And then it found a home at Random House. And I think there were 25 titles coming out that spring when it was coming out hardcover. And I made the mistake, and my editor was telling me not to, is a dear friend to this day. I said, well, where are we in that 25? He goes, hey, you want to know. And then his name's Gary Brosick. I go, no, what we got? He goes, he kept like shrugging off. And finally, I called up the PR department at Random House. I said, oh gosh, I got this novel coming out in the spring with you guys. Where is it? Among the 25 other titles in hardcover. PR person on the other end goes, you really want to know? I went, yeah. He goes, you're 25th. But
You made it.
yeah, and then Gary called later that day, and I was kind of bumped, and he was going, you called, didn't you? And then he kind of said something I'll never forget. He said, don't worry about it. We're going to have a lot of fun, and we're just going to find the people that are into this and do it. And so, an army of support always helps, but you don't need it right away. You're just trying to find the one or two people that believe as much or even more, or understand it as much as you do. And then you get rolling. So, and I guess the other thing I would say too is I tell my students this at Hopkins, because I've got some great students. I've had some great students over the years. I mean, Monica Hesse's now at the Washington Post. I mean, Nicole Chung just came out with another great memoir, The Theory of Reality. Alma Katsu is a best-selling novelist, Nalva Putnam. But with all of them, I said, you got to do it almost every day. Right. If you're waiting for inspiration, there's gonna be some big gaps, and you kind of forget maybe where the story's going. Right. And I try to boil, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I boil it down to just a couple sentences. Mm-hmm. And I put it up on my bulletin board because I tend to be kind of dense. I kind of forget what I'm working on sometimes. And with the case of Curveball, it took a while. And I guess Gary helped out a little bit, but the line was, what was it? A love story set in Old Havana about a baseball pitcher who might have been. That's it. But from there, you can go all over the place, and you can, that's your net. Because then you can go out and do all these things. And if they don't work, you go, hang on, what was I writing again? Oh, that's right. I'm writing a love story in Old Havana. Yeah, okay, we'll come back to that. So, but yeah.
You gave me the segue in about love stories. There's 1,000 stories in that head of yours. No, I want to know if you would mind. There's a scene in Cancer Crossing when you start going out with Jackie, your wife. This is nonfiction. I wonder if you wouldn't mind telling the people about this story about how you first started going out with your wife of several years now, going on several years. Right. I'd like to hear it, and that's I think other people might too.
Well, I think sometimes you got to put things out there and see how people respond. And I don't know, it's just a whole bunch of stuff with Jackie over the years, but the thing that stands out to me now is coming back from my grandmother's funeral, and she was big in sororities. I was not in fraternity life, and somehow she had ditched her date, and I met her. I'd driven back from Lockport, and I was stunned that she was like 10:30, 11, still around, and she was still all dressed up for like some formal, and I was a wreck. And I just, and I think kind of one of the first things out of my mouth was, why do the people you love so much have to die? And I don't know. And she won me over. She was there. So
Thank you. Good story. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, shall we?
Any other questions?
She's been there all along, even though sometimes she's always pretty much right, having to pump up the The tires.
Yeah.
Well, let me set this up just a bit.
Would you like the PowerPoint or your video?
Let's just go right to the video. And yeah, don't hit it quite yet. This is, when you go into the world of film and everything, it's kind of weird. They have what they call sizzles or trailers. And this is pretty much brand spanking new. This has been shaved down. Now, this is no way is this going to be done, but we finally have some quality backing. I think this is for summer of '68. Sam Pollard, who did the Bill Russell doc that's on Netflix right now, is on board to direct. And so you kind of go back where I think we still got to play with the end of this a little bit, but it's weird now. Like there's two ways things get spread around. One is with a so-called sizzle or trailer. And originally we had this way too long. It was like 5-6 minutes. This is like 3 something. And then the other one is everything's being done with pitch decks these days, which is bizarre. You know, it's like kind of a slide PowerPoint. And that's how we're pushing kind of a mashup, a combination of both the Cuban novels is that way. I think we'll maybe be a trailer at this point. But what this does is get circulated around, and it's looking for backing 2 ways. Number one, money wise, even though I think we're maybe looking okay, knock wood on that, but also talent. You know, who else is going to be involved? And you can see there's already a fair amount of talent on this. And the other thing, when you're doing something that's based in '68, we've been really fortunate that you're going to see some individuals popping up here as talking heads that aren't with us anymore. And thankfully we got them. We got them on tape like 2 years ago. So with that in mind, roll it.
Okay.
A lot of things kind of roiling around in 1968. I hear people say stick to sports. I don't know whether to laugh or cry.
It's pretty clear that it's going to be the Cardinals and the Tigers in the World Series.
I know we had the best team. I think my teammates know we had the best team.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
Martin Luther King was assassinated just as the '68 baseball season began.
I was delivered the news at the Outrigger Inn where we were staying in St. Petersburg, and we were going out to dinner. Roger said, "Did you hear the news?" "What news?"
It was Roger
He
Maris.
said, "Martin Luther King was just killed in Memphis."
Difficult day, this difficult time for the United States. It's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in.
There were places, college was understanding community, economic ability, etc. They could not join from a member and go to. We couldn't get the same kind of jobs or weren't equal opportunities.
Why is it always talking about whites and blacks? Because everything happening here is racial. It's all based on race and religion. You understand?
That's excellent.
We still,
I really want to see it now.
we gotta get it finished, but
Yeah, but
we're still messing with it. It's funny because we had a longer one and Sam, the director, and I think he's dead on. He's, and I don't think we quite got it yet, but he's really saying, play up Gibson, play up McLean. And Denny McLean, the last one to win 30 games. Gibson has an earned run average of 1.12 and 68, which we'll never see again. And they were very, you talk about two different ways up to the mountain or top of the mountain, that was them. And Gibson pretty much, we're talking in 68 after King's assassination and Kennedy's, he was able to channel his anger into such phenomenal starts. And in the start of the season he had wasn't all that great, but after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, he has a great line. He said, I became man infuriated. And you can see that when he's on the mound. Whereas Denny McLean was, I think, in my mind, one of the first of the modern athletes who embraced celebrity. That's what he wanted. He was going to use his baseball talent and what he was doing, to be a star. In fact, somewhere in 68, he was asked, what's your real goal here, Denny? Is it to win, be the first guy since, I don't know, 40 years or something to win 30 games? They have the Tigers win the pennant, help the city heal, all this type of stuff. And he just kind of looked at the guy interviewing and said, no, I want to be on the Ed Sullivan Show. And he was. And he was a very accomplished organ player, keyboard player. So, but that was him. So anyway, so that's what you do. You send around these. Yeah, go ahead.
Our students today in college were not born when 9/11 occurred. How is this relevant to them?
I think the point we're trying to make with it is many of the same struggles we're fighting, and I think the more you learn about certainly something like a Bob Gibson or Willie Horton, who single-handedly tried to stop the Detroit riots. What's Ken Burns always telling me? He says, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes sometimes. I think it's rhyming again, big time. And we're doomed to kind of.
Is that from the Seamus Haney poem?
But yeah, I think it is. Yeah, we took it from that. And so I think if we're going to move ahead, we got to know about 68 in some ways. It's funny because I just finished a novel that'll be out next spring and very much close to home. It's called Rebel Falls. It'll be out with Three Hills imprint, which is part of Cornell, their trade imprint. And looks like it's about in May. And one of the things I've had some fun with it is it's set in 1864 in Niagara Falls, and it's Confederate spy, and they come close to seizing the only remaining warship on the Great Lakes. And if they had done that, they were going to shell Cleveland, Buffalo, any place else I could get a hold of on the eve of the presidential election, and Lincoln would have lost. This is all based on historical fact. But one of the things I'm able to work in there is, you start hearing from the Confederate spies, especially the one guy, John Yates Beale, he's pretty much spouting the same white supremacist stuff you hear today. And that kind of hits home with me as one who lives in Charlottesville, because, we've been fighting that the last couple of years. And it's interesting. So, people, in my mind, people need to know, or else we make some of the same mistakes.
Yeah. And so with that, we'll see you again next year for sure. So great,
I just started to work on covers.
Yeah,
Which is always
but,
interesting. What?
But yeah, we're getting kind of,
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably getting past it.
but I did want to thank you very
Mary,
much.
thank you
It
very
was
much for
such
your
a-
Thank you all for coming.